Franz Kafka, a literary figure who, at first glance, might make you think, why does this man complain so much? Why does his life seem filled with nothing but suffering? And honestly, Kafka's life was never one of sunshine and rainbows. It was more like a dark tunnel where a person keeps walking without ever knowing whether there will be light waiting at the end. But here's the strange part. During his lifetime, Kafka never received the recognition he truly deserved. It was only after his death that the world realized the depth of what he had left behind. Today, he is remembered not just as a writer, but as one of the greatest voices to ever describe the reality of human suffering. In this video, we're not going to summarize his books. We're not here to explain what happened in the Metamorphosis or what the trial is about. No. Today, we're going inside Kafka's mind. We'll explore his psychology, decode some of his most powerful quotes, and understand the philosophy that gave a language to modern human anxiety. Before you can truly understand any philosopher, you first have to understand the life that shaped them. Because behind every quote, there's a wound. Behind every philosophy, there's a trauma. And behind every profound idea, there's a human being who was broken long before they became wise. Franz Kafka was born in 1883 into a household where authority filled every corner of the home. His father was physically powerful, aggressive, and deeply dominating. He had risen from humble beginnings through relentless hard work and built a successful business with his own hands. Naturally, like many fathers, he carried one expectation above all else. My son will become a man like me. But Kafka was nothing like his father. He was physically frail, thin, quiet, deeply introverted, and completely absorbed in books. He wanted to study chemistry. He loved literature. But to his father, those passions were meaningless. In his eyes, only professions that earned society's applause deserved respect. Law, medicine, or engineering. Exactly the same mindset that still exists today. Become a lawyer. People will respect you. That pressure became the first psychological prison of Kafka's life. He initially enrolled in chemistry, but under his father's relentless pressure, he was forced into studying law instead. Slowly, Kafka began to feel that his life no longer belonged to him. It was as if someone else had taken the remote control of his existence. This is where Kafka's philosophy truly begins. The fear of authority, an invisible force capable of crushing individuality. His father stopped being just a parent. He became the symbol of an entire system, a system that constantly whispers, "You will become what we decide, not what you dream of becoming." When a sensitive mind is forced again and again to abandon its own identity, only two outcomes remain. Either it rebels or it slowly collapses from within. Kafka collapsed. He withdrew into his room. Writing became his escape, a place where nobody judged him, where nobody held authority over him. Writing became his shelter, his refuge, his private cave. Just like a child who locks himself inside the bathroom during a loud, chaotic party simply to experience a few minutes of silence, Kafka closed the door on the outside world and disappeared into writing. He worked in insurance companies for years, largely because he desperately wanted to create some distance between himself and his father. But fate had other plans. Everywhere he went, bureaucracy, meaningless routines, and endless pressure seemed to follow him. He spent his days working and his nights writing. The night was when Kafka truly felt alive. The daytime was merely survival. During this period, he met Max Brod, an intelligent, confident, charismatic man. Ironically, Max Brod was everything Kafka's father wished Kafka could become. Yet despite their differences, Max became Kafka's closest friend. Sometimes the people who understand us best are the ones who are completely different from us. Kafka's relationships also struggled because inside him lived a constant conflict. One side longed for intimacy, while the other craved complete solitude. He wanted someone to truly understand him, yet at the same time, he wanted to be left entirely alone. This contradiction exists inside many deep thinkers, and that emotional conflict slowly pushed Kafka further into anxiety. His anxiety became so severe that he could barely meet the woman he was engaged to. Imagine loving someone, yet lacking the courage to simply stand in front of them. One day, Kafka wrote a letter to his father, nearly 50 pages long. Every page carried years of pain, frustration, and emotional wounds that had never been spoken aloud. He poured his entire soul into those pages, but he never found the courage to hand the letter over himself. Instead, he gave it to his mother and asked her to deliver it. She couldn't. She was too afraid of Kafka's father herself, so she quietly returned the letter. Think about how terrifying that must feel, to be so afraid inside your own home that even your own voice never reaches the person it was meant for. In 1924, Franz Kafka died from tuberculosis. At that time, tuberculosis was almost a death sentence, but before he left this world, he gave humanity something priceless. He revealed the raw truth about suffering. He showed us that suffering is not an exception. It is part of the human condition itself. And perhaps that's why, even today, millions of readers open Kafka's books and find themselves staring back from the pages. If you enjoy exploring philosophy, psychology, and the hidden depths of the human mind, consider subscribing to the channel, because this is where we go beyond surface-level ideas and explore the questions that shape who we truly are. After understanding Kafka's life, it's time to decode his thoughts, because the real world of any philosopher or writer is hidden inside their words. And Kafka's quotes are not just clever lines, they are psychological wounds. Wounds that cut straight through the human mind. One of Kafka's most famous quotes is, "The first sign of the beginning of understanding is the wish to die." The first time someone reads this, it feels shocking. You immediately wonder, why is he talking about death? But Kafka isn't talking about physical death. He's talking about a painful realization. As children, the world feels magical. Everything seems full of hope because we don't see reality. We see possibilities. But slowly, life introduces you to betrayal, rejection, failure, loneliness, anxiety, and disappointment. Then one day, you realize that this world isn't made of rainbows and sunshine. And at that moment, a strange feeling appears inside you, a desire for everything to stop. Not because you truly want to die, but because you want to escape. Escape from reality. Escape from the weight of existence. According to Kafka, that moment marks the beginning of true understanding. But then Kafka takes the idea even further. He says, you wish to die, but you do not die, because death would be the victory of the absurd. And this is where one of the most important ideas in his philosophy enters, the absurd. Have you ever sat alone late at night and honestly asked yourself, why am I doing all of this? Why did I go to school? Why did I earn a degree? Why do I need a job? Why earn money? Why build a family? Why follow society's rules? Why does religion exist? Why was I born? And what happens after death? What if nothing happens at all? Every one of these questions leads to the same place, absurdity. The strange, almost impossible reality that existence itself has no obvious explanation. Think about it. A giant planet is floating through empty space. Humans are running around on it, building roads, filling out forms, going to offices, creating relationships, chasing dreams, and eventually dying. Yet everyone behaves as if all of this is completely normal. To Kafka, existence itself was absurd. Perhaps that's why his own father became the symbol of absurdity in his life, a terrifying authority figure whose actions had no emotional logic. One incident stayed with Kafka forever. One night, he simply asked his father for a glass of water, just water. But his father became furious, dragged him out of bed, locked him outside on the freezing balcony, and left him there in the cold. Imagine what that child must have felt in that moment. Fear, confusion, humiliation, helplessness. That single experience left a permanent scar. Later in life, Kafka developed symptoms similar to PTSD. He would wake up in the middle of the night expecting his father to appear again, punish him again, humiliate him again. Over time, authority itself became something he feared on a deeply psychological level. Yet despite everything, Kafka never completely surrendered. He kept writing. Quietly, silently, he continued fighting for his individuality. That is why he wrote the famous 45 to 50-page letter addressed to his father. Not because he believed it would change anything, but because sometimes people cannot say what they truly feel face to face. They can only say it on paper. Writing became his way of resisting, his way of reclaiming his voice. There is something incredibly powerful about putting emotions into words. The moment you write your anger, guilt, frustration, or pain, you begin to take control of it instead of letting it control you. Even today, psychologists recommend journaling for the same reason. Don't let emotions endlessly circle inside your mind. Put them onto paper. Kafka did exactly that. Another one of Kafka's remarkable quotes says, "You do not need to leave your room. Remain sitting at your table and listen. Do not even listen. Simply wait. The world will freely offer itself to you." This quote carries an incredibly deep message. Kafka believed that the world constantly tries to manipulate you. It wants your attention. It wants your emotional reactions. It wants to pull you into its endless chaos. But the moment you become still, the moment you stop reacting, the moment you simply observe, the world slowly begins revealing itself. Silence is a form of power. Observation is a form of power. The person who refuses to react immediately becomes difficult for the world to control. The same psychology appears in human attraction. Imagine the most admired person in college. Everyone gives them attention. Everyone chases them. But then one person doesn't seem interested at all. Suddenly, curiosity appears. Why isn't this person paying attention to me? Human psychology rarely values what is constantly available. It values scarcity. It values mystery. Kafka wasn't simply describing dating or attraction. He was pointing towards something much deeper. The less you participate in the world's emotional games, the more clearly you begin to understand the world itself. Perhaps Kafka's most heartbreaking quote is this: "I have the true feeling of myself only when I am unbearably unhappy." In other words, he believed he encountered his real self only during moments of unbearable suffering. It sounds dark, but there is something profoundly honest about it. Most people live behind masks. I'm fine. Everything's great. Life is going perfectly. But these are often social performances. When the room becomes silent, when distractions disappear, when you're completely alone with yourself, the mask begins to fall away. That's when your real emotions appear. Kafka believed suffering strips away illusion and reveals the raw truth of who you are. The same pattern exists throughout his stories. His protagonists rarely find happy endings. Instead, their suffering keeps growing. Just when they escape one nightmare, they fall into another even deeper one. Through these stories, Kafka normalized suffering. He argued that suffering isn't a special punishment reserved for a few unlucky people. It's the default condition of being human. Everyone suffers. The forms are different: loneliness, rejection, anxiety, failure, meaningless routines. But suffering itself belongs to everyone. That is exactly why Kafka still feels so relevant today. Modern life has turned anxiety into an epidemic. Millions of people smile for photographs, post perfect moments online, and pretend everything is fine, while quietly falling apart inside. Kafka understood those invisible battles long before the modern world gave them names. He wrote in the language of people who felt trapped inside their own minds. And perhaps that's why, even today, so many readers open a Kafka book and feel as if someone has finally described emotions they were never able to explain themselves. Franz Kafka wasn't just a writer. He was a man who saw the nightmare of modern society long before the rest of the world even realized it existed. That's exactly why an entire term was eventually named after him, Kafkaesque. It describes a bizarre, suffocating, nightmare-like reality where the system becomes so confusing that people slowly begin to lose their sanity. A world where rules exist, but logic doesn't. where punishment exists, but nobody can explain the crime, where people spend their entire lives running, yet have no idea where they're actually going. In Kafka's stories, bureaucracy exists like a monster. In the trial, a man is suddenly arrested without any clear reason. No proper explanation is ever given. The system simply declares, "You are guilty." And if you look honestly at the modern world, it often feels disturbingly similar. Forms after forms, verification after verification, identity cards, e-signatures, KYC checks, passwords, one-time passwords, approvals, permissions. A person has to cross countless barriers just to prove who they already are. You walk into a bank to withdraw your own money, yet the system still asks you to prove that you are actually you. Kafka wasn't criticizing paperwork alone. He was exposing a deeper form of psychological control. Kafka believed that systems eventually stop treating people like human beings. Instead, they reduce them to file numbers, application forms, database entries, and identification codes. Slowly, people begin forgetting their own humanity. That is why the people in Kafka's world often feel emotionally disconnected, cold, and mechanical. Bureaucracy doesn't just organize society, it slowly destroys empathy. A doctor begins seeing patients as case numbers instead of human beings. A banker sees customers as procedures instead of people. A university treats students as enrollment IDs rather than individuals with dreams and fears. This is what Kafka meant by dehumanization. Human beings disappear and only systems remain. Kafka feared authority because he experienced its darkest side throughout his entire life. First through his father, then through institutions, then through society itself. Over time, he realized that every system tries to shape individuality into something predictable, obedient, and safe. But there is a hidden cost. The more obedient a person becomes, the further they drift away from their authentic self. That realization eventually pushed Kafka toward existential philosophy. Existentialism asks one terrifying question. If life has no fixed meaning, then how do you create meaning for yourself? For Kafka, that question was both frightening and strangely liberating. Frightening because it suggested there was no guaranteed purpose waiting for anyone. Liberating because it meant every person had the freedom and the responsibility to create their own purpose. Kafka often wrote about existential dread, that deep anxiety that appears when people realize how uncertain existence truly is. We don't know why we're here. We don't know exactly where we're going. We don't know when death will arrive or what, if anything, comes afterward. And because facing that uncertainty is almost unbearable, people hide inside routines, systems, religions, distractions, careers, and endless responsibilities. They cling to certainty because the truth is terrifying. Life is fragile, it is random, and sometimes it is completely unfair. Yet Kafka wasn't interested only in darkness. He also left behind an idea that feels surprisingly hopeful. He believed that failure is beautiful. Society teaches people to worship success, a perfect body, a perfect career, a perfect relationship, perfect timing. But Kafka believed perfection itself is an illusion. People spend their entire lives waiting for the perfect moment. I'll start going to the gym next Monday. I'll chase my dream when I feel confident. I'll begin when everything is finally ready. Then one day, life ends, and that perfect moment never arrives. Kafka himself struggled with procrastination. Many of his stories remained unfinished, but he never stopped writing. He understood that imperfect action is infinitely better than perfect paralysis. Failing isn't embarrassing. Never trying is. Perhaps that is why Kafka's writing feels so deeply human. He wasn't a polished motivational speaker pretending to have all the answers. He was a broken man, patiently arranging the broken pieces of his own soul into words. Kafka also believed something that remains just as important today. You are the main character of your own story. The world will constantly try to steal the remote control of your life. Parents will tell you who you should become. Society will tell you how you should live. Friends will decide what's acceptable. Social media will quietly decide your value before you even have a chance to decide it for yourself. But the moment you hand over control of your own life to other people, you stop being the protagonist. You become nothing more than a background character in your own story. Another idea that fascinated Kafka was alienation, the slow process of becoming disconnected from your true identity. It happens when you spend so much time shaping yourself according to other people's expectations that you eventually forget who you really are. What's interesting is that the moment you genuinely begin changing, people often become uncomfortable. If you were once weak but suddenly become disciplined, people will say, "You've changed." If you were always available but begin setting healthy boundaries, some people will become offended. Not because you've done something wrong, but because they had already created a version of you inside their minds. They became attached to that version, and they don't want to lose it. That is why real growth often feels lonely. As you evolve, certain people naturally drift away because the person they knew no longer exists. Kafka understood this loneliness better than almost anyone. His characters constantly feel isolated, misunderstood, and disconnected from the people around them, as though the world simply cannot understand who they really are. And perhaps every person who thinks deeply eventually experiences that same feeling at least once in life. Maybe that's why Kafka remains so relevant even today. In many ways, modern life has become increasingly Kafkaesque. Endless notifications, endless forms, endless expectations, endless anxiety, endless systems demanding more of our time, attention, and identity. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise stands a human being searching for one simple thing that no system can ever provide: a genuine sense of meaning. Perhaps the darkest and most dangerous part of Kafka's philosophy was the brutally honest way he looked at human psychology. He never believed in comforting illusions. He never claimed that simply thinking positively would transform your life. Instead, Kafka looked at human beings in their rawest form, in fear, in shame, in anxiety, and in emotional suffering. He realized that people are controlled not only by physical chains, but by psychological ones as well. According to Kafka, the most powerful force in the world is authority. And authority isn't limited to governments alone. Authority can be your parents, your school, your religion, your workplace, your relationship, or even your own fears. The problem isn't authority itself. The real danger begins when authority becomes blind, when a system grows so powerful that questioning it no longer feels possible. At that point, people slowly begin losing their individuality. Kafka observed how society constantly divides people into categories. This person is successful. That person is a failure. This one is intelligent. That one is a loser. And once society assigns you an identity, escaping it becomes incredibly difficult. If you're labeled as the weak student in school, teachers begin treating you that way. Friends begin expecting you to remain that way. Eventually, you start believing it yourself. This is what Kafka considered psychological imprisonment. This isn't merely philosophical theory. You can see it everywhere in real life. Whenever someone genuinely tries to change, society often becomes uncomfortable. If an introvert suddenly becomes confident, people accuse them of pretending. If an overweight person starts going to the gym, others laugh at them. If someone finally sets boundaries with a toxic family, they're suddenly called arrogant or selfish. Why? Because people were comfortable with the older version of you. Your growth forces them to confront their own stagnation, and that makes them uncomfortable. Kafka believed that every human being lives with a constant internal conflict. On one side exists your authentic self. On the other side exists the version of yourself the world expects you to become. Most people spend their entire lives performing that second version until the day they die. They never truly become themselves. That is why so many people feel an emptiness that success can never fill. They impress the world while quietly abandoning the person they really are. Kafka also understood something deeply unsettling about guilt. Human beings often live under its weight. I'm not good enough. I failed. I made a mistake. Systems of authority know exactly how powerful guilt can be, and they frequently use it as a tool of control. Religion can use guilt. Parents can use guilt. Relationships can use guilt. Society can use guilt. People are constantly made to feel incomplete so that they remain obedient, constantly searching for approval they may never receive. His observations feel even more relevant in today's digital world. Every major platform quietly sends the same message. You are not enough. You need a better body, a better lifestyle, more money, better looks, higher productivity, more success, more validation. And the result is exactly what we see today. Anxiety becoming an epidemic, comparison becoming an addiction, and self-hatred becoming increasingly common. If Kafka were alive today, he might describe social media as the greatest bureaucratic prison ever built for the human mind. Kafka often portrayed authority and bureaucracy as surreal monsters, vast invisible machines that continuously grind human beings into smaller and smaller pieces. Go to school, earn a degree, get a job, pay your taxes, fill out endless forms, wait for approvals, spend decades preparing for retirement, then one day die. Somewhere in the middle of that endless routine, people become so exhausted that they never stop to ask the simplest question of all: is this really my life? That is why Kafka spoke about existential awakening. He believed there comes a moment when a person suddenly realizes they have been living on autopilot. And that realization is deeply painful, because in that moment, every mask begins to fall apart. The fake smile, the fake confidence, the fake relationships, the fake ambitions. Once those illusions disappear, a person faces a choice. Either run back into distractions and pretend nothing happened, or stand still and face the truth. Facing that truth was never easy for Kafka himself. He struggled with anxiety, loneliness, insecurity, and relentless self-doubt throughout his life. But instead of suppressing his suffering, he observed it. He analyzed it. Then he transformed it into words. That is why his writing still feels so alive today. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was confessing. Perhaps that is why emotionally intelligent people connect with Kafka so deeply. He doesn't offer comforting fantasies or motivational slogans. He offers uncomfortable truths. He reminds us that life can be unfair. Systems can be broken. Human beings can be cruel. And, despite all of that, we still have to keep living. We still have to create meaning. We still have to protect our individuality. Maybe that is the real meaning of courage, not the absence of fear, but the decision to continue despite it, to keep creating even while broken, to accept your truth even when it leaves you feeling completely alone. Most people spend their entire lives trying to understand the world, but the person who truly understands themselves eventually discovers that the world is no longer quite as terrifying as it once seemed. Kafka's philosophy reaches its darkest point not when it says the world is cruel, but when it reveals something even more unsettling. The world is indifferent. It simply doesn't care whether you're suffering or not. The universe doesn't pause for your pain. The sun still rises, people still go to work, traffic still moves, and life continues as if nothing happened. Then one day you realize that while your suffering feels like an entire universe to you, to the rest of the world, it's just another ordinary day. And this realization pushes a person toward an existential crisis. Kafka's characters remain trapped inside this crisis, constantly searching for meaning, while the world refuses to offer clear answers. The truth is, modern humans are doing exactly the same thing. All of us are chasing meaning in one form or another. Some search for it in money, some in love, some in religion, some in fame, and others in endless productivity. Yet deep inside, there is always a silent fear. What if none of this actually means anything? Kafka confronted that fear directly. That is why his writing feels uncomfortable. He never created distractions. He stripped away illusions. And removing illusions is painful, very painful. Kafka also noticed another disturbing truth. Human beings spend very little of their lives truly present. Most people are either trapped in regret about the past or consumed by anxiety about the future, while the present quietly slips away. Kafka himself suffered from relentless anxiety. He feared relationships, failure, authority, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. Perhaps that's why his writing feels so authentic. It wasn't polished wisdom delivered from a stage. It was the raw confession of an anxious mind. Anxiety isn't simply fear. It's an imagination that constantly manufactures worst-case scenarios. What if everything falls apart? What if people reject me? What if I fail? Eventually, a person begins living more inside imagined disasters than in reality itself. This is the psychological prison Kafka understood better than almost anyone. According to him, the greatest tragedy of modern life is that people have become disconnected from themselves. They are so busy surviving that they no longer stop to observe what they truly feel, what they genuinely desire, or who they originally wanted to become. Society piles so many labels onto them that their authentic identity becomes buried beneath expectations. That is why Kafka valued solitude so deeply. Being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. A lonely person searches for validation from the outside, while a person in solitude observes themselves from within. Most people fear silence. That is why they constantly reach for their phones, music, notifications, endless scrolling, conversations, and noise. Silence forces people to hear thoughts they have been trying to escape, and not everyone has the courage to face their own truth. Kafka wrote during the night when the world was asleep and distractions disappeared. Night carried a strange kind of honesty. During the day, people perform roles: employee, student, friend, partner. But at night, those masks begin to crack. That's why the deepest thoughts often arrive at 2 in the morning. Am I really happy? Is this life truly mine? Why do I feel so empty? Kafka gave those silent questions a voice. Then he delivered another brutal truth. No matter what you do, you can never completely escape the system. And this system is far more than governments. It is the system of expectations, social norms, financial pressure, and invisible rules that quietly shape your entire life. The most dangerous part is that, over time, you begin to accept it as normal. Wake up, go to work, carry stress, wait for the weekend, hate Monday, repeat. One day you suddenly realize that your entire life has been running on repeat. For Kafka, this routine wasn't merely boring, it was horrifying, because he believed human beings were slowly transforming into machines. Today, that reality has become even more disturbing. Algorithms decide what you watch. Trends decide what you wear. Social media decides what you should admire, desire, or envy. People believe they are making free choices while their psychology is being influenced every single day. Kafka also explored what later came to be known as alienation, the feeling of becoming disconnected from your own existence. Today, millions of people experience exactly that: lonely in crowded rooms, empty despite having thousands of followers, emotionally disconnected even while surrounded by relationships. Real depth has disappeared, replaced by surface-level connections. That is why Kafka remains timeless. Technology has changed, systems have evolved, but human anxiety remains the same. Human loneliness remains the same. Human fear remains the same. Yet Kafka himself was never only about darkness. His very existence was an act of rebellion. A physically weak, anxious, chronically ill man transformed his suffering into art. He didn't write to impress the world. He wrote because writing was the only way he knew how to survive. And perhaps that is why his words still feel so alive today. When a human being expresses their deepest pain with complete honesty, they are no longer telling only their own story. They are giving a voice to the hidden emotions of millions of others. If Kafka's entire life could be summarized in a single sentence, it would probably be this: a man trying to protect his soul in a world designed to crush individuality. And honestly, that struggle wasn't Kafka's alone. It belongs to every person who feels too deeply, who overthinks, who refuses to accept the world at its surface. Kafka was physically fragile, mentally anxious, and emotionally exhausted. Yet he never stopped observing the world. Perhaps that was his greatest strength. Most people escape reality. They bury themselves in distractions. Kafka chose to face reality directly, and whatever he discovered, he wrote down with complete honesty. And honesty is dangerous, especially self-honesty. It isn't easy to admit that you're lonely, insecure, addicted to approval, or living in fear. But until a person accepts their own reality, they can never become truly free. For Kafka, freedom wasn't simply about physical independence. Real freedom was psychological. It meant refusing to let the world define your identity. It meant making decisions that weren't driven entirely by fear. It meant existing for something greater than society's approval. But that kind of freedom comes at a high price. The moment you begin becoming your authentic self, resistance begins. Family grows uncomfortable. Friends become distant. Society starts attaching labels. The world prefers predictable people. It prefers obedient people. Independent thinkers have always appeared dangerous because they refuse to fit neatly inside predefined boxes. Kafka lived under that pressure his entire life. The pressure of his father, the pressure of society, the pressure of career expectations, and the pressure of relationships. Yet despite everything, he never allowed his individuality to die completely. That is why Kafka's greatest lesson isn't depression. It is awareness. Awareness of suffering, awareness of control, awareness of fear. The moment you become conscious of these forces, you begin escaping unconscious slavery. Kafka never glorified suffering. He normalized it. He believed suffering wasn't an abnormal interruption of life. It was part of being human. And the person who accepts suffering becomes mentally stronger because they no longer live inside unrealistic fantasies. They stop collapsing every time life becomes painful because they understand that pain is woven into the human experience itself. Perhaps that's why Kafka's writing offers such a strange kind of comfort, a dark comfort. When you read someone who gives words to emotions you've never been able to explain, you suddenly realize, I'm not alone. And sometimes that realization alone is enough to keep someone alive. Kafka died of tuberculosis in 1924, but the greatest irony is that the man who spent his life feeling misunderstood became one of the most understood writers after his death. Before he died, he asked his closest friend, Max Brod, to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts, destroy everything. But Brod refused. Instead, he published Kafka's work, and because of that decision, the world was introduced to one of the greatest literary minds in history. Sometimes a single friend can grant another person a kind of immortality. Today, the word Kafkaesque exists in dictionaries around the world. Imagine that. An anxious, insecure, introverted man who spent much of his life feeling like an outsider has become a permanent part of humanity's psychological vocabulary. That is the power of art. That is the power of authenticity. And perhaps Kafka's greatest message was this: the world may never feel completely meaningful, but you can still create your own meaning. Systems will try to control you. Fear will try to stop you. Anxiety will constantly make you doubt yourself. Yet despite all of that, you can still create. You can still think. You can still observe. Most importantly, you can choose to live consciously. Most people spend their entire lives on autopilot. They never stop long enough to examine who they are becoming. They never ask themselves, is this really the person I wanted to become? Kafka's philosophy is that pause button. It forces you to stop, to reflect, and to confront the chaos within yourself. And once you learn to face your own inner chaos, the chaos of the world no longer feels quite so terrifying. So remember this: the world will always try to define you. It will attach labels, expectations, and identities to your name. But your true identity is never what the world places upon you. Your true identity is whatever remains in silence after every mask has fallen away. And perhaps that is where real freedom truly begins. If Kafka were alive to witness the modern world, he probably wouldn't be shocked at all. The nightmare he imagined in the early 1900s is the reality we already inhabit. The only difference is that the chains have changed. Back then they were visible. Today they are invisible. Authority once shouted commands. Now it manipulates. Control was once enforced through force. Today it is delivered through dopamine. Modern people appear physically free, yet they remain mentally imprisoned, trapped inside notifications, validation, endless comparison, and invisible algorithms. The most dangerous part is that they rarely realize they are being controlled. Kafka's characters were always confused. They never understood what crime they had committed, yet they carried an overwhelming sense of guilt. Modern people often experience the same invisible burden. They constantly feel inadequate. I'm not productive enough. I'm not attractive enough. I'm not successful enough. Every day, social media quietly reinforces those insecurities. Open Instagram and someone is showing off a perfect body. Someone else is living a luxurious lifestyle. Another displays a flawless relationship, while someone else delivers motivational speeches about success. Gradually, your ordinary human life begins to feel inferior. Your mind slips into comparison mode, and comparison is psychological poison. Kafka never witnessed social media, but he understood human insecurity so deeply that his philosophy feels even more relevant today. Another hidden danger of modern life is what could be called a performance identity. People play so many different roles that they eventually lose sight of who they really are. One personality online, another around friends, another with family, another in relationships. Over time, even they can no longer recognize their authentic selves. Kafka was fascinated by this fragmentation. In the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa wakes one morning to discover he has transformed into a gigantic insect. But this was never simply a story about physical transformation. It was a symbol of the modern individual, someone who slowly becomes an insect inside the machinery of society, reduced to a worker, a bundle of responsibilities, a tool valued only for usefulness. The most disturbing part of the story is not Gregor's transformation. It is his family's reaction. Gradually, his humanity stops mattering because society rarely values your soul. It values your usefulness. As long as you earn money, entertain others, or remain useful, people stay close. But the moment you become weak, the world's behavior begins to change. Kafka observed this truth with remarkable clarity. That is why his characters often feel isolated even while surrounded by other people. Modern life reflects the same loneliness. Thousands of followers online, yet almost no genuine human connection. Constant communication, yet very little real understanding. Relationships increasingly revolve around convenience rather than depth. Kafka also made another brutal observation. Human beings are addicted to certainty. They crave fixed answers, fixed meanings, and fixed identities. That is why people cling so tightly to labels. Religion, nationality, profession, ideology. Labels create the comforting illusion of security. But Kafka believed existence itself is naturally uncertain, and those who cannot tolerate uncertainty eventually build lives ruled by fear. Fear-driven people are also the easiest to control. That is precisely why systems of authority so often rely on fear. Do this or you'll be punished. Believe this or you'll be rejected. Follow these rules or you're wrong. Fear creates obedience. But to Kafka, a blindly obedient life was a form of spiritual death. Hidden beneath all of his work is one powerful message: observe the system, but never lose yourself inside it. You may never completely escape society, You still have bills to pay, responsibilities to fulfill, and work to do. But do not become a machine psychologically. Protect your individuality. Protect your ability to think independently. Protect your silence. Because the greatest danger of the modern world is not physical exhaustion. It is psychological numbness. It is the moment a person stops feeling, stops wondering, stops reflecting, and begins existing only to survive. Kafka himself was never a perfectly happy man. Perhaps he never found lasting inner peace, but he accomplished something priceless. He gave human suffering a language. And once suffering has language, it ceases to be meaningless pain. It becomes understanding. Perhaps that is why deep thinkers often seem dangerous. They refuse to see the world the way everyone else does. They look beneath the surface, and once you've seen too much, innocence becomes almost impossible to recover. Kafka's philosophy will never make you comfortable. It will wake you up. And sometimes awakening feels like a curse. Yet perhaps that awakening is also where real life truly begins. Franz Kafka was never just a writer. He was a mirror in which modern humanity can see its own distorted reflection. Perhaps that's why his work feels so deeply unsettling. Kafka didn't write stories about monsters. He wrote stories about human beings, and sometimes the human mind is far more terrifying than any monster could ever be. He left us with one brutal truth. The world may never become fair. Systems will remain broken. Authority can become abusive. Relationships can be fragile. Anxiety may never completely disappear, and existence itself may never offer us a final answer. Yet despite all of that, we still have to live. And perhaps that is the purest form of human courage. To keep living despite confusion, to keep creating despite suffering, to keep loving despite heartbreak, and to keep thinking despite fear. Kafka's characters rarely find certainty. They rarely reach satisfying conclusions or discover perfect answers. But that was exactly his point. Life is not a clean movie script where every question receives a neat resolution. Sometimes the greatest challenge is learning to live with uncertainty itself. In today's world, that challenge has only grown harder. Silence has become rare. Reflection has become rare. People spend their lives running from themselves through endless reels, notifications, trends, validation, and constant noise. So much noise that they can no longer hear their own inner voice. Kafka chose a different path. He sat quietly with his darkness. He looked directly at his anxiety, his loneliness, and his deepest fears, then transformed them into words. That is why his writing never feels artificial. It doesn't sound like a polished motivational speech. It feels raw, almost like bleeding honesty, real, human, and beautifully broken. Society will always try to hand you masks. It will tell you to appear strong, to look perfect, to seem successful, and to hide every weakness. Kafka did something incredibly dangerous. He refused to hide his vulnerability. He exposed it completely. Ironically, that vulnerability became the very reason he achieved immortality. The world may remember perfect people for a while, but it remembers honest people for generations. Even today, millions of readers encounter Kafka and think, someone finally put my mind into words. The loneliness that cannot be explained, the anxiety that appears without warning, the emptiness that exists even in the middle of a crowd. Kafka gave language to emotions that most people struggle to describe. His life, by conventional standards, was not a success story. He never became a wealthy celebrity. He never found lasting inner peace. He remained a struggling, anxious, often sick man. Yet he left a permanent mark on humanity. Why? Because lasting impact is not created through perfection. It is created through authenticity. Billions of people exist in this world, but only a handful ever live with complete honesty. Perhaps Kafka's greatest lesson is this: never allow your individuality to die. The system will try to reduce you to a number. Society will reduce you to a label. Social media will encourage you to become a performance instead of a person. but protect the real self that exists beneath all of those identities. The moment someone loses that inner self, they may remain physically alive while becoming psychologically empty. For Kafka, writing was survival. Every human being must discover their own version of that survival. It doesn't have to be writing. It could be art, music, fitness, solitude, or any practice that reconnects you with the person you truly are beneath the world's chaos. So if you ever feel lost, disconnected, or if life begins to feel painfully absurd, remember this: your confusion does not necessarily mean that you are broken. It may simply mean that, for the first time, you are beginning to see reality as it truly is. And once a person genuinely begins to see, it becomes almost impossible to return to comfortable ignorance. Franz Kafka died in 1924, but his fears, his philosophy, and the questions he asked continue to live within humanity. That is why reading Kafka is not merely an exploration of literature. Reading Kafka is an exploration of yourself. If you found yourself reflected in these ideas, consider joining this journey, where we explore not only self-improvement, but also the deepest and darkest corners of human existence. Until the next lesson, observe the masks you wear, and before you move on, ask yourself one question: is the life I'm living truly my own?